All right, guys. So this week we're going to begin to be covering the digestive system, some aspects of nutrition, the urinary system, and the reproductive system. So, um, just to start it all off, uh, there's various aspects of these systems that are shared between them, um, and that includes aspects of anatomy. Now, with the digestive system, where we're going to start this lecture, the digestive system really begins with our mouth. Okay, so mechanical and chemical digestion begins in the mouth. Saliva is part of the chemical digestion of food. And the whole idea behind the digestive system is to extract any material needed to provide cellular functions, biochemical functions within the body. So it's more than just energy, because there's aspects like vitamins and minerals, as well as what's called trace elements, that all play a role in health and function of the body. So none of the upper digestive system should really be new. We covered a lot of this in the respiratory chapter, because the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx really are shared, and it's technically part of the upper respiratory tract as well. So once you enter the esophagus, though, that's where we really enter the quote unquote true digestive portion of the body. Now, the esophagus, you can think of, is one really long, smooth muscle tube that's going to connect the mouth to the stomach, where a big portion of digestion begins. A big aspect of the stomach is that it has acid in it, relatively low pH, so it's very acidic. And this is going to help break down chemical bonds. And there's certain enzymes that function in the stomach as well that do their best work in a low pH environment. So once food passes through the stomach, you enter a space of the small intestine called the duodenum. And the duodenum is a very interesting location, okay? It's a highly specialized, about 10-inch long segment of the small intestine. And at this location, we get a bunch of stuff just dumped in on top of everything that just came out of the stomach. So, coming from the pancreas, you have what we collectively term as pancreatic juice being secreted via the pancreatic duct. Okay. This juice contains some more enzymes. There's going to be bicarbonate, which is actually very important because the acid in the stomach is actually very harmful to the rest of the digestive system. The stomach is highly evolved to handle being exposed to that acid, but the rest of the digestive tract isn't evolved to handle it, and that's because of what it really does as a function. So bicarbonate will be released into the duodenum, and this is actually going to help neutralize the acidic pH. We have bile that's going to be coming from both the liver, where it's actually produced, and the gallbladder, which is where it's stored and concentrated. And bile is very important in the digestion of fatty foods. It does a process called emulsification, which is major in being able to break down those long hydrocarbon tails that exist on lipids. And so we end up with all of these various materials getting dumped into the duodenum, and it all gets mixed and passes on to the next part of the small intestine, called the jejunum. And the jejunum is the longest, or it's the shortest of the two main small intestine areas. Okay. Following the jejunum is what's called the ileum. The ileum is the longer of the two, at about 12 feet, I believe, whereas the jejunum is only about 8 or so. A big thing to realize in this area, though, is that the small intestine is kind of wrapped up, it's coiled around, and held together by what's called the mesentery. Okay, there's various different mesenteries in the abdominal cavity, but the one that holds the small intestine together really is just called the mesentery. Okay, and within this mesentery, we have a ton of vasculature. Okay, so for instance, with the small intestine, we have essentially what's called the superior mesenteric artery. Okay, it's one of the major branches of the aorta in the abdomen, and it supplies a large amount of blood to the jejunum, it gives blood to the ileum, and it gives blood to both the ascending and transverse colon, actually about only 2/3 of the transverse colon. Okay, and the mesentery really exists not just to coil this 20-foot long section of digestive tissue, but it also protects all of the nervous, vascular, lymphatic, etc., all of the tissue that's within that area as well. Now, what's really interesting, as I was talking about the vasculature, right, is there's another major branch called the inferior mesenteric artery. Okay, and there's going to be a vein, obviously, to match these, but the inferior mesenteric artery actually will cover what is the lateral 2/3 of the transverse colon, the descending colon, sigmoid colon, and the rectum all get covered by this artery. And you might think, well, why doesn't the superior artery supply blood to the superior stuff? And why doesn't the inferior artery supply blood to the inferior stuff in the abdominal cavity? Well, it actually has to do with the way that the body develops in embryology. And because of the way that it develops, we kind of get 2/3 of the abdomen on the right side, and the full small intestine getting covered by one, and the left third and descending aspects of the large intestine all get covered by another. It's actually a very interesting part of development. And there's another third really important trunk called the celiac trunk, which actually sits above the superior mesenteric, and that actually supplies the what's called foregut, or the upper parts of the abdomen. So that it's going to actually supply the stomach, the duodenum, the liver, and the spleen. All of that is going to be supplied by the celiac trunk. So just keep in mind that because of the function of all of these tissues, right, they want to bring stuff into the body. So they're going to be highly vascular. There's going to need to be a lot of blood supply because there's going to be a lot of diffusion of not just macromolecules that'll be used for energy, but micromolecules like vitamins, minerals, trace elements. And that's a big, important part of the digestive system. Now, within the digestive system, a lot of the cells have little appendages called microvilli or just villi. And these actually kind of almost act like little fingers, right? So the villi projects off the end of the cell and is actually let me go back here, because the actual villi is just the term for the appendage that the liver or the intestine tissue actually has. So it kind of looks like fingers coming off of the wall of the intestine, and these fingers are made up of a number of cells, and within there, there's going to be lymphatic tissue, capillaries, which obviously lead back to veins and arterioles, or venules and arterioles. And a lot of these cells will also, on top of them, have what's called microvilli, which kind of are like you could think of as kind of a suction cup that an octopus has. It's where they can grab onto and absorb extracellular material much easier. So with that, right, the food will then pass, through the full small intestine. It goes through what's called the ileocecal valve, which would be right here where the ileum meets the ascending colon. Well, it meets the cecum, and the cecum is a special area on the small intestine that people would know because of the appendix hanging off. And the appendix is a big deal because while it's technically thought of as lymphatic tissue, it's important in abdominal health because if it ruptures, there's actually a lot of bacteria in the cecum and in the appendix. And that bacteria will be able to infect the outside of the abdominal cavity. The bacteria that live in the abdominal cavity normally are well adapted to live within the abdominal cavity. They won't cause infection within the abdominal cavity. They get outside of it, though, that's a different problem, because now they can actually get direct access via the mesentery vessels to the bloodstream and spread systemically. And a untreated ruptured appendix can actually be incredibly life-threatening because of this infection risk. Now, as you enter the ascending colon, you'll travel up through the transverse colon. Again, transverse is going to be across in the transverse plane. The descending colon, and through the sigmoid and the rectum, and then out of the body. The large intestine primarily exists. It has a much larger diameter, but its primary function really is to solidify and remove liquid from the waste products of the digestive system. So this is going to be where a lot of water is reabsorbed. There's still going to be some other different aspects of the diet that are handled here, but the large intestine primarily is to reuptake water and recycle other liquids. So I've already talked, based on the lecturette, I've already talked about the kind of accessory organs within the abdomen. But just remember that while the pancreas is an endocrine organ, it's also an exocrine organ, and its exocrine secretion is what's called pancreatic juice. Now we're going to go on to the urinary system. Okay, so with the urinary system, we have two kidneys, one left, one right. There's a left and right, or right and left, ureter, a urinary bladder, and a urethra. Now, anatomy-wise, there's, or I should say at the gross anatomy level, there's not a lot to this. A big thing to note is that the kidneys are going to be at slightly different elevations in the body. And we actually see that represented well in this picture. And that's going to be actually because of the liver on the right side is going to push the right kidney a little lower. Now, each kidney is going to have a renal artery, which will branch several times as it enters the kidney, and we'll see why it branches in a second, as well as a renal vein going back to the inferior vena cava. That is several branches as well that are all termed renal vein. There's also one ureter for each side, all right? Now, really the function of the kidney is to filter the blood. And part of this filtration process is to help control water balance and electrolyte balance. And those two things kind of go hand in hand, as we've talked about before. If there's too much sodium in the blood and not enough water, the kidney's going to filter out and not reabsorb sodium, but it's going to also want to keep the water. The kidney also plays a role in red blood cell production. So if blood pressure or blood volume are too low, the kidney can secrete in an endocrine fashion something called erythropoietin, or EPO. And EPO is a hormone that you've probably heard before in like a sports performance enhancement type thing, because the idea is that more red blood cells can carry more oxygen. Okay, so if you have a decreased blood volume or decreased blood pressure, one way to fix that is to have more red blood cells to fill the space. Now, the kidney also plays a major role in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and it also secretes renin, which really starts that process off to cause the excess reuptake of electrolytes and therefore water as well. So we look here and got the kidney cut in half, and we'll see what's going on here, right? So the blood will enter here. Okay, it's going to go through a variety of splits as arteries and arterioles get much smaller. But really, we have two components to the kidney where filtration actually occurs. You have the cortex and you have the medulla. Now, this area here is called the renal pelvis, and this is pretty much where all of the filtered material is either going in and then being divided up to different parts of the kidney, or it's leaving via the renal veins or the ureters. Okay, so and they leave a special opening in the kidney called the renal hilum. Now, what you'll see here on the right is what's called a nephron. And the nephron is the actual filtration unit within the kidney. And part of the nephron, or two different parts actually, are called convoluted tubes. And you see exactly why they're called convoluted tubes. They look pretty convoluted. They're all over the place. And this is partially because of surface area. So it's going to loop itself around a bunch and it's going to provide a greater surface area. Now, each of these areas of the nephron have slightly different cells within them, and each of those cells are specialized for reabsorbing certain things. So, for instance, in the descending loop, we will see a lot of electrolyte reabsorption, and you see that too in the ascending loop. Now, the specific electrolytes can vary between the sides, but what we have is the blood comes in via the renal artery. It's going to enter the proximal convoluted tubule, get filtered through the PCT, and then it's going to enter what's called the loop of Henle. And the loop of Henle essentially has a couple different parts to it. There's a descending and ascending component. And then there's a distal convoluted tube. The distal convoluted tubule dumps in to the vessel that takes the filtration at this point to the renal pelvis and to be excreted via a process called micturition or urination. It then goes down the ureter and enters the bladder. The bladder is a very interesting organ because it's a smooth muscle lined organ that can expand. Once it hits a certain expansion, there's neural processes that cause it to contract and expel the waste product. It's also worth noting that when it is expelled from the bladder, it's going to travel down the urethra, and the urethra in men and women is different. The urethra in men tends to be much longer and actually is not properly just called a urethra. There's going to be 3 different components to it based on where it's at within the body. And because of the differences, though, in these the lengths of the urethras, women who only have a, I believe, 1 to 3 inch long urethra, they tend to be at a much greater risk for urinary tract infections because of this. And those infections can be of the ureter itself or even up into the bladder, because the bladder is relatively close at that point. And this is why we typically only see UTIs in females. Now, moving on to the male-female reproductive system. So we talked about some aspects of the reproductive systems and biological sex characteristics with the endocrine system. Now, the primary sex hormones are really made in their highest concentrations within these reproductive organs. So in the males, testosterone really only is made in the testes. In females, estrogen, progesterone with the ovaries. So with the male reproductive system, we're going to see, as I was talking, the urethra here is pretty much 3 different components to it. There's going to be the component here, there's a name for the component here, and then there's a name for the component once it passes out of the abdominal wall. But essentially what happens is in the testes, testosterone's produced. Testosterone will play a role in the creation of sperm. This is called spermatogonia. At this point, they're immature sperm cells, and they must undergo maturation. These sperm cells will then come from the epididymis and travel along the ductus deferens or vas deferens. And they'll then go to the prostate gland. And this is an organ that only exists in men. And it kind of sits just beneath and slightly posterior to the bladder. And this is why, particularly in older men with enlarged prostates, they have issues with urinary continence. So the prostate gland will enlarge and will push on the bladder. But the problem is the bladder still wants to expand to a certain point. Well, the muscle that actually closes off the bladder from the urethra won't be getting a signal that, hey, the bladder's full, because the muscle itself that makes up the urinary bladder has not stretched to that point yet that the mechanoreceptors in the wall of the bladder have recognized this. But there's still going to be that pressure put on the muscle, the sphincter muscle, that is blocking the exit of the bladder. Eventually, that will just give out. And that's why BPH, which is one of the enlarged prostate conditions, can cause urinary incontinence. Basically, with the prostate gland, you'll get a mixture of a couple different fluids along with the sperm. And during the process of ejaculation, all of that will exit the body. So, hormonal control, this is going to be, again, a simple negative feedback loop. It's not anywhere near as complex as the females, but it's also important for us to remember that the adrenal glands can produce what's called androgens and androgen precursors. And these are essentially precursors to male sex hormones, and they can be processed a lot further, and they can actually be turned into estrogens as well. But it's important to recognize that the initial growth of the body is, in childhood, is kind of guided by the adrenals, as the reproductive organs are still essentially developing. And once you hit puberty, we get a massive dump of hormones, and in this case, male sex hormones when males enter puberty, and that causes the what we call secondary sex characteristics of males, and that's going to be growth of body hair and enlargement of the voice box and the vocal cords. You'll see thicker skin, particularly on the palms of the hand, where skin is already thicker. You're going to have a major increase in muscular growth, because testosterone is a major stimulator of a gene pathway called the mTOR pathway, mammalian target of rapamycin. There's going to be a thickening and strengthening of bones, because again, testosterone really is an anabolic hormone. It's designed to build. Now, the female reproductive system really is actually kind of straightforward in comparison to the males, where we have a couple different stuff, doing different things and meeting up. Well, we don't necessarily have as much detail of that in the female system. The hormonal control of the female system, though, is a lot more difficult. So essentially, the gamete made is the oocyte, or the egg, and that is made within the ovaries. Now, there's an ovary in the right and left side of the pelvic cavity, and essentially There's tubes that connect the ovaries to the uterus, and as oocytes are formed and matured, they get released into these tubes. They're actually kind of pulled along by what's called the fimbriae of the ovarian tubes, and eventually end up in the uterus. And the uterus is where the oocyte would be kept for fertilization. And if fertilization occurs, it's also where the offspring will begin developing. Now, what we see is an important part of this, though, is there's a high vascularization to all of this tissue here. Okay, so and you can see here on this highlight the fimbriae. Now, the female reproductive hormones are pretty much estrogens or estrogen derivatives. And these have slightly different secondary sex characteristics. They're going to cause enlargement of female sex organs. There's going to be development of breast tissue, increased adipose deposition, and there's going to be a lot more vascularization of the skin in females. This hormonal control also leads to what's called menstruation and what's called menopause. So with menstruation, there's a regular recurring change to the endometrium of the uterus. This change involves the endometrial wall thickening over a cycle. There's going to be changes in concentrations of progesterone and estrogen, as well as a couple other hormones. And the idea is that these changes will cause a release of an egg during a period that's called ovulation. And essentially, if fertilization does not occur, that egg essentially is evicted from its home in the uterus, and there's a shedding of the endometrial wall of the uterus. And this shedding releases the characteristic cyclical, commonly called period, that occurs about every 28 days. Now, this is going to occur in healthy individuals for at a highly specific pattern until the age of somewhere between 40 and 50, where females will undergo what's called menopause. The ovaries essentially produce less estrogen and progesterone over time, and that causes the cycle to become a lot less predictable. But eventually, the cycle will actually end, and that is called menopause. There's going to be a drop in estrogen and progesterone to the point that the cycle no longer occurs. And with that, you can see some changes to the older female's body, like a decrease in fat. But one thing that's heavily linked to menopause that we mentioned briefly in our musculoskeletal lecture is osteoporosis. And estrogen is a big, just like testosterone, it's an anabolic hormone, but not to the same degree. It has a good affinity for essentially causing calcium to be integrated into the bone. So with reduced estrogen, we actually see less calcium deposited in the bone, which leads to brittle bones and osteoporosis.